Welcome to Notorious Minds, where we examine those that have altered destinies and changed human history by M.R. Parks. Warning: the following video contains violent content, graphic images, and descriptions which may be considered disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised.
During the autumn of 1987, the prosperous city of Richmond, Virginia was terrorized by a serial killer. The mysterious killer inflicted chaos on the state capital. A sadistic torturer leaving little to no evidence. This is the Southside Strangler, the life of Timothy Wilson Spencer. Richmond, Virginia is a compact city with a healthy mix of people who are well off and those that are not. In the mid-1980s, the affluent areas of Virginia's capital were far removed from its more troubled neighborhoods. Richmond was sort of a quiet southern town, and any crime you heard of was gang violence. Now the Southside District was a peaceful area. Timothy Wilson Spencer was born on March 17, 1962. He was raised in Green Valley District of Arlington, Virginia. It was a lower income neighborhood. However, it had areas where there was very hard-working people living there. His mother's name was Thelma Spencer. Both his mother and his father had some college. They worked hard, but eventually divorced at some time. Miss Spencer, a hard-working, devoted mother who made sure her two boys, Timothy and Travis, had nightly dinners at the table together. Miss Spencer juggled a busy life, bringing up her children as a single parent. She was a good mother. She provided everything. She spent time with her children. They ate their meals together as a family. They were pretty much a structured family. Timothy Wilson Spencer had been in trouble of various kinds of things since he was 9 years old. He got into crime early and stayed in it. As the older sibling, Timothy would naturally look out for his younger brother, Travis. Timothy and Travis were 10 years apart. By all accounts, Timothy Wilson Spencer should have been a well-rounded individual, just as his younger brother Travis was. Timothy did have good moments of being a loving brother, teaching his brother Travis to ride his first bike at Christmas time. Now it was Christmas and Travis got an orange bike with the training wheels on it. So the boys go out in the street and Timothy was like, "Hey, the first thing we need to do is take these training wheels off." For about 5 hours, they just rode on the bike. Big Timothy was behind Travis with his hand on the seat guiding Travis as he rode, even though Travis ran into a parked car. And Timothy said, "You can't be looking back at me. You got to keep your eyes on the road." He definitely seemed to be a loving brother. Timothy Spencer stood out in the neighborhood. He was gorgeous, very handsome, and the girls screamed because he had hazel eyes. That's what made him unique. They would even change colors. He was always quiet around everybody. He only talked when he was alone with his little brother. And he grew up in a lower income neighborhood of hard-working families who lived there for years and years. Travis Spencer recalls how his older brother's behavior deteriorated on the streets of his hometown of Arlington. There were several guys that pretty much terrorized the neighborhood, and he was one of them. But early on, there were signs that Thelma, his mother, missed about her son Timothy. A person who is singled out a lot because he was very attractive or unique, especially if they're narcissistic, they will believe that they should be afforded certain treatment. And when they don't get it, that could cause anger issues. Timothy increasingly struggled to conform. His behavior drastically deteriorated during his school years. He was a poor student. He was difficult. He was intelligent enough, but did very little in school. At some point, when he was about 12 years of age, he was urinating and defecating in public areas of the school. Timothy would even set fires in his early years, which feed his yearnings for domination and control. One day, Travis and his friend were playing outside. One of the guys Timothy ran around the neighborhoods with was throwing rocks near Travis and his young friend. Accidentally, one of the rocks the boy threw hit Travis in the face, right under his eye. His face started to bleed, so he ran home to his mother. The rock gave Travis a black eye. Suddenly, Timothy walked in and asked his little brother, "What the hell happened to your eye?" When Timothy found out one of the young dudes he ran with hurt his little brother, he told Travis, "Don't worry, little bro. I'll take care of it." The next day after that, the dude that hit Travis with the rock showed up, found him standing at a bus stop. "Hey, little Spencer," he said, apologizing profusely. "I'm sorry, little man, I hit you. Are you okay?" Travis said, "Yes, I'm okay. We're cool, man. It won't happen again. We're cool, right?" the dude said. Travis said, "Yeah, we're cool." But little Travis noticed the young guy had a black eye as well. Later that day, Timothy, his brother, came to him and said, "Did that boy apologize to you?" Travis said, "Yeah, he apologized to me." Timothy looked at his little brother and said, "I told you I'd take care of it." Clearly, Timothy indeed did take care of it. One day, Travis asked his big brother could he hang out with him. Usually, Timothy didn't let Travis hang with him when he was roaming around in the neighborhoods, but this day, Timothy said okay. Timothy and the dudes he hanged with were walking around the neighborhood with his little brother. They saw a couple of stray cats in the neighborhood. They took one of the stray cats and put it in a pillowcase. Then Tim and his friends started throwing rocks at the pillowcase with the cat inside. Travis grabbed Timothy's arm saying, "Don't do that, don't do that." But Timothy was like, "Get off me. Get off me, man." It seems that Timothy was intent on harming the poor cat in the pillowcase. Travis didn't want to see his brother harming the cat, so he turned around and left. A couple of days later, Travis found out from his friends that Timothy set the pillowcase with the cat in it on fire. When little Travis asked his brother Timothy, did he really set the cat on fire, Timothy just said, "It wasn't me." But psychopaths are notoriously known to be habitual liars, and many serial killers have been known to harm animals in their early years. They definitely like to set fire. They kind of get a sick thrill out of it. Ted Bundy did it, and so did Jeffrey Dahmer. These actions tend to be a model of behavior for the worst of criminals. The first time Timothy went to juvenile detention, it was because he burglarized a home, his mother's home. One day, Travis and his mother went to go get something to eat. When they returned from getting the food, they noticed that the back window in the house was open. When they looked around the house, they noticed that they had been robbed. Their mother went straight for the money drawer, the place where her and her boyfriend had put money that they were saving. And she saw that all the money was gone, $1,500. Only 4 people knew where that stash was: Timothy, Travis, Ma, and the boyfriend. When Timothy comes home, his mother confronts him. "Why did you take the money?" Of course, he denied it. "I just got here," he says. "I don't know what happened to the money." His mother felt betrayed. "How can you steal from us? We worked hard to put that money away." Timothy just continued to deny that he stole the money. Timothy didn't care. He had no empathy, no compassion, no caring, and no respect. So they filed a complaint with the police, and the police locked up Timothy. He was in detention for 8 months. That incident changed how Travis, his younger brother, looked at Timothy. Timothy regularly stole and burglarized possessions in the neighborhood. Travis got it in his head one day as a small boy. He thought he had to steal to be accepted as well. Travis had a friend, and they went to the convenience store and stole some candy. The clerk jumps around the corner and says, "Stop, thieves!" So the police came, and the officer took Travis back home. When Miss Spencer came to the door and saw it was Travis, her whole face changed, looking shocked that her youngest son would repeat his older brother's action. Travis thought Timothy would be proud of him, but surprisingly, Tim told him, "Always do the right thing, little bro. Don't be like me. Be better than me." Timothy was in and out of jail and juvenile hall for burglary. He would take collector's items, coins, silver, memorable items. items that he could pawn. He would come home from jail for maybe 2 to 3 months, then do it again, but Travis still optimistic that one day his big brother Timothy would leave that lifestyle alone. Each time Timothy trespassed and broke into places, he was perfecting his craft. He was becoming good at what he was doing. He learned not to repeat the same mistakes with each crime. He was becoming a better criminal. As Timothy Spencer approached his 20s, his escalating career of crime would lead to severe consequences. The eventual burglary that he went to prison for in South Arlington, the border of the city of Alexandria. For breaking into a house, he was caught inside the house, so he was serving time for breaking and entering. Travis remembered crime because his brother was in jail. When Travis used to see him, Travis couldn't understand why his big brother was behind bars. When Travis got older, he finally understood right from wrong, and if you do wrong, that's where you go. Now, once you go to prison, there's only 2 things that happen, Travis said. Either you're going to do better or you're going to become a better criminal. Spencer would be released in September of 1987, having served 3 years in prison. On one occasion, Travis remembers Timothy calling from the jail. His little brother picks up the phone. He tells little Travis to get rid of the Bootsy glasses. You need to get rid of them, he said. They were very expensive circular glasses with stars in them, and they were filled with diamonds on the glasses. It was at least a couple of $1,000 for those glasses. They were similar to the glasses that Bootsy Collins wore. William Earl Bootsy Collins was an American bass guitarist, singer, songwriter, and record producer. Travis can hear the fear in his brother Timothy's voice saying, "The cops are coming right now. Throw them in the trash." The police cannot find these glasses. Young Travis knew that those phone calls at the jail were recorded. Travis thought to himself, I can't do that. I'm going to get myself in trouble. If I throw away those glasses, Timothy was basically making his own little brother an accessory to his crimes. Travis said to himself, I'm not having any parts of this. And when the police showed up, Travis told him where the glasses were. Travis didn't feel like he was betraying his brother because Timothy was the one that always told him to do the right thing. They pressed charges and he was in jail for a year. And from that incident, Timothy learned to never leave evidence lying around the house. He was becoming more skilled at his crimes. He stashed the stolen items around the outside of the house, but he would never bring them inside. Once Timothy got out of jail, his brother noticed that something changed with his older brother. He became a different person. During another incident, it was Thanksgiving, and the whole family was at Grandma's house. Timothy Wilson was always locked up during Christmas and Thanksgiving time. As the family was sitting around the table enjoying Thanksgiving dinner, the family started talking about the weird things that Timothy used to do, calling him crazy. That boy is crazy. I still can't believe what he did to that bird. Timothy's mother's friend had a parakeet, and she asked their mother to look after the bird while she was away. But Tim got hold of the parakeet, and the parakeet ends up dead. The family sitting at the table continued to talk, but that's nothing compared to what he did to that gerbil. Timothy was upset with a family member who had a gerbil. He decided to kill the gerbil. He took some push pins and pushed them in the gerbil's eyeballs. He put them through the eyeballs, the nose, and the head. He created his own little pin cushion. Most people can't do that to an animal, but Timothy Wilson Spencer could. Something was definitely wrong with young Timothy. He got a perverse thrill out of torturing things. Timothy liked controlling and dominating things. Eventually that change would be from animals to people. As a boy, Travis Spencer always told himself that the cruel pranks his older brother Timothy played on him were ultimately harmless. But he would be wrong. He never suspected that his brother was using him to practice methods of torture that would be used on others. He would choke his own little brother until he couldn't cry anymore. Travis would beg him to stop the choking, but young Timothy was getting a perverse thrill out of it. Timothy would hide in the house unbeknownst to Travis, who thought he was home alone. He would then jump out with a mask over his face and put a knife to his throat, pretending to be a burglar, and he would terrorize his own little brother by pinning him to the wall with the knife up to his throat. After Travis would beg for his life, then Tim would remove the mask and start laughing. Timothy Wilson Spencer enjoyed inflicting terror on his little brother. The more fear Travis showed, the more Timothy would terrorize him. One day, Timothy did it again. This time he tied up his brother and put a gag in his mouth. He then threw his little brother in the closet. While Travis was in the closet, he was finding it hard to breathe with the gag in his mouth. Luckily, he was able to untie himself and remove the gag. Timothy was sadistic. He loved inflicting terror, but Timothy's rebellious actions were not confined to childish pranks. He also had a history of arson. In a cul-de-sac in the neighborhood, that's where he started a fire. Fire setting gives individuals a sense of control, power, and a sense of domination, because with the match you could burn down a building, set a car on fire, and this type of power control is stimulating for some of these kinds of individuals. After a stint in prison, he was placed in a halfway house 100 miles away from Arlington in the Southside district of Richmond. His apartment was upstairs on the left-hand side. It's a transitional house for non-violent offenders. If they're non-violent, they would serve their time and they'd be brought to this house so they can be acclimated back into society. As young Spencer settled into his new surroundings, he would keep the staff and residents firmly at arm's length. He was a loner. He didn't talk to anybody. He didn't have any friends. When he ate near the end of the table. He wouldn't engage in conversation. If he watched TV, he would sit on the other side of the room away from everybody. However, Timothy did cultivate a relationship with a female member of the staff, servicing her car. This opened up opportunities for the reclusive resident, Timothy Spencer. The only person he talked to was that woman whose car he used to work on, so he could drive it around and cruise the local neighborhoods and visit the Cloverleaf Mall in nearby Chesterfield County, supposedly returning to the halfway house in daylight hours. Normally in the halfway house, you're released to go out and work, and you have to come back in at night. You're not allowed to go out overnight, but Spencer wasn't playing by the rules. You are supposed to be supervised check-in and check-out, but that was not happening at all. Timothy Spencer continued to roam the streets at will. When Timothy returned home, Travis would notice that his brother would often disappear at night. And on the next morning after Timothy returned home, Travis saw Timothy in the bathroom scrubbing his tennis shoes clean, as if he was removing evidence. Then one night, Timothy got a ride from a family friend to Virginia's South Side. Suddenly, Timothy tells the family friend to stop here. Timothy gets out of the car on the highway, not far from the Cloverleaf Mall, and walks away. The Cloverleaf Mall was a popular hangout for Timothy. The quiet loner had plenty to reflect on as he seemingly watched the world go by, sitting in the food court. During September of 1987, Richmond detective Ray Williams received a call that would shock the suburban serenity at 10 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. Debbie Delaney Davis, on September 19, 1987, the victim of a horrific attack, was 35-year-old magazine accounts clerk. Debbie, a bookkeeper, she lived alone in a first-floor apartment. She'd been married briefly and then divorced. She had a warm smile, very engaging, very friendly. When the detective saw the body, he assumed it was somebody she knew. The first place they would look would be at associates' boyfriends. The detective's initial suspicions proved to be way off the mark. As he entered the first-floor apartment, he knew he had a special case. There were certain things that stood out which suggested to the police that some sort of ritual was going on. She was lying face down on the bed. Her upper torso was hanging off the bed. She had one hand tied behind, the other bound with shoelaces, and they tied to a point where if you pull one end, it would tighten the ligature. Her mouth was gagged. She then had 2 socks tied around her neck and a 16-inch vacuum cleaner extension hose twisted in the ligature. The victim, although she was sexually assaulted, was redressed after the crime. There was a large amount of seminal fluid, which could only have come from the perpetrator pleasuring himself. Detective Ray Williams and another detective contacted her employer that she had been murdered the night before. Debbie didn't have an enemy in the world. Faced with a seemingly motiveless murder, investigators attempted to piece together the killer's movements. They walked around the premises and checked behind the bushes. The intruder's entry point soon became apparent. The kitchen window had an outdoor rocking chair below it. He balanced on it, cut the screen of the window, and crawled right into her place. Detective Ray Williams realized one thing. It told him the perpetrator would be somebody very agile, somebody very strong. From the height of the window, you could see he had to be strong enough to lift himself into the window. The perpetrator had to be very athletic, strong enough to do that. Then he sat in the house waiting for her to come home. The perpetrator would use his time to prepare for the attack. He used materials that were in the house. He didn't bring things with him. And the killer's use of the homemade tourniquet was chillingly sadistic. He raped her while he choked her, close to the point of death, and she would pass out. Then she would come to, and he would choke her again. He repeated this process a number of times. It was particularly brutal. How he ultimately killed her was really awful, like torture, strangling and waking back up over and over and over again. The Southside residents were shocked by the brutal slaying. The silent killer was already planning to terrorize their neighborhood again. It was September 1987 that the Southside District of Richmond, Virginia, suffered this horrific murder at the hands of a sadistic killer. Police struggled to find a lead, and 2 weeks later, Detective Ray Williams of Richmond was called to peaceful Southside one more time. 2 weeks later, and only half a mile away. It was a quiet neighborhood, middle class, nice homes, very low crime rate. Dr. Susan Helms, she was a neurosurgeon at the Medical College of Virginia. On October 3rd of 1987, police were acting on a gruesome discovery made by the doctor's husband on his return home. And after a late night at work, her husband went upstairs, and the bed was messed up. The sheets were in disarray, and you could see the doors of the closet were open. Investigators later saw that her hips and legs were inside the closet. I personally believe that her body was in the closet, but from the weight of her body, it pushed against the door and may have knocked her back out of the closet. Because why would her legs and her hips be in the closet, but not the rest of her body? She was sexually assaulted, identical to Debbie Davis. She was savagely beaten. She also had a gag in her mouth. A most brutal killing. As with the murder of Debbie Davis 2 weeks earlier, the intruder had meticulously covered his tracks. Nothing was left. Not a fingerprint, not a hair, nothing that could be used to identify the perpetrator of the crimes. The only thing that was left were semen secretions. The city immediately went into a panic. Once it was identified as a serial killing, everything in the city was changed. You could walk through Forest Hill Avenue, every light was on, every deadbolt lock and hardware stores was sold out. Women in particular were told, if you're not feeling safe where you are, then just nail your windows shut. The community was scared to death. The killer would strike again. This time, Diana Youngwon Cho, but most people called her Diane. She was a young 15-year-old freshman at Manchester High School. The teenager was a diligent student with her sights set on medical school. Her family were immigrants from Korea who had only been in the U.S. for 3 years. On November the 21st of 1987, she had ended the day at her computer studying in her bedroom on Saturday night. Then Detective Ray Williams got the call. A 15-year-old had been strangled and tied up, just like his other victims were. On arrival at the Choice apartment, the Richmond detective would be shocked by the perpetrator's audacity. Her brother was in the next bedroom. Her parents were in the house as well. While in the dead of night, Timothy Spencer came in through a window. So the bold Spencer binds her. He risks everything. She was actually raped and strangled in her own bedroom. The agile killer had struck in the dead of night, the entry point where he scaled a 2-story building into her bedroom window. Leading up to her attack, Diane had previously told her friends that when she arrived at the Chesterfield Mall, she noticed a man staring at her and following her around the mall. Diane felt like she was being stalked. She even saw the same man at her parents' convenience store. Diane even noticed a particular moment when she went to buy movie tickets at the movie theater with her best girlfriend, and she saw the man standing in the parking lot staring at her. Diane's girlfriend would go on to say that the man's eyes looked dead, that they were the coldest eyes she had ever seen. The next day after the murders, Diane's mother, Yen Young, and her husband, Young Shol, left in the morning to run errands, leaving Diane and her 12-year-old brother, Roman, home alone. Mrs. Cho then called the house to let her children know to get ready for church for Sunday evening. Roman, Diane's brother, did not go into the room because he didn't want to annoy his sister. When Diane's parents came back from running their errands, her mother went into her room to get her and discovered her lifeless body of her only daughter and screamed in horror. Diane was laid out across her bed facing the door. She was covered with a sheet across her private areas. Her face was purple and the window near her bed was open. Roman, her little brother, ran to call 911, since he and his sister were the only ones in the house that spoke English. The operator who answered the phone told Roman to administer CPR, but Roman said to the operator, "It's too late. She's already gone." And he spent quite a bit of time in there with her, and apparently he never made enough noise to wake up her parents. He posed his victims in a way that made him feel powerful, which led FBI profilers to suggest that the perpetrator was statistically more likely to be a white male in his 30s. But a discovery of the crime scene suggested otherwise. He left one hair inside the bedsheet, but as detectives set to work on the long-awaited lead, they were unaware that the killer was about to strike again. Susan Tucker. Susan Tucker joined the Stranglers' list of victims the next month when she was found, like the others, raped and strangled in her Arlington home. As the end of November approached, the local community was preparing for the Thanksgiving weekend. One such resident was publications editor Susan Tucker. Susan Tucker, age 44, was a young professional that was a little quiet and pretty much kept to herself. She didn't have a bad bone in her body towards anybody. She was home alone. Susan's husband Reggie had worked as a photographer, but then took a job in his native country of Wales. Susan was planning on joining her husband in Wales as soon as she finished selling the Arlington County home. She had a close friend who visited her regularly after Reggie left for Wales. But suddenly, Susan stopped answering her friend's phone calls. She assumed Susan was just busy because of the Thanksgiving holiday, but unbeknownst to her, her husband Reggie had not spoken to her in days either, which was very unusual because they spoke every day. After several days of Susan not answering her phone, her best friend became alarmed. Then she noticed that Susan's bedroom window had been open for a few days since she was also Susan's neighbor. She then went over to her house and knocked on the door. As she stood on Susan's porch, she noticed the foul odor emitting from Susan's bedroom window. Her friend then ran to call the police. "Please come and do a welfare check on my neighbor. I think something may be wrong." Joe Horgus and his colleagues were called to Susan's address in the Farlington district and immediately smelled the foul odor. As police entered the home, there was no immediate sign of Susan Tucker, but there were immediate indications of a robbery. A woman's purse was thrown across the living room floor, and open drawers had clearly been ransacked. The investigators' robbery case quickly escalated to murder when they entered the couple's bedroom. Susan Tucker was deceased, lying face down on the bed. Her ankles were tied, bent upward at the knees, and bound to her wrists behind her back. She was hog-tied from her ankles to her hands to her throat. Her cause of death, ligature strangulation. Whoever had broken into the Tucker home was a sadistic rapist as well as a murderer. To Arlington homicide investigators Joe Horgus, the state of the victim at the Tucker crime scene was unfortunately not unique. Horgus recalled another case from nearly 4 years earlier where the victim was found with similar bindings. But the 1984 murder of Carolyn Hamm had been resolved when the suspect, David Vasquez, had confessed. Vasquez was currently serving a 20-year sentence. Then Detective Horgus learned of more recent cases with similar circumstances, but in Richmond, Virginia, 100 miles away. A recent series of Richmond victims had been bound, raped, and murdered in the months prior to Susan Tucker's death. Though the Richmond detective didn't agree, Horgus was convinced that the rapes and murders belonged to one perpetrator, despite the distance. The offender's signature was too specific. At this point, the hunt for the Southside Strangler took an odd turn. Two found dead on the same day, January 16, 1988, Renea Taporis, and a few blocks away, Michael St. Hilaire. Though initially thought to be the work of the Southside Strangler, Kapoor's death was determined to be the work of a copycat, and she had not been raped as previous victims, and St. Hilaire's death was ruled as a suicide. Horgus faced difficulties in convincing his colleagues in Arlington and in Richmond that the cases were connected. The unwillingness to see such connections is called linkage blindness and is a major obstacle to serial murder investigations. Part of what makes it so insidious is that the objections raised by skeptical detectives were not entirely unreasonable. In one break-in, someone entered a woman's house through a basement window and when no one was home. He spent some time in that house. When the woman came back, she found the burglar left pornographic magazines and a length of Venetian cord on her bed. In hindsight, it is easy to see that he was waiting for her to come home, at which point he intended to rape and probably kill her. But at that time, the connection simply wasn't that obvious. By re-interviewing the rape victims, Detective Horgus was able to trace the development of the rapist's methods from early, clumsy, often unsuccessful abductions off the street to in-home attacks where his control of the victims was not as good. Horgus found that over time the rapist's methods became more refined and resembled the murders more and more. In one of the rapes, a woman was awakened in the very early morning by a black man wearing a ski mask and armed with a knife. He threatened her, taunted her, made her drink Southern Comfort whiskey. He tied her up and for 3 hours raped and tortured her. At the time that he produced a length of rope that presumably would have been used to hang or strangle her, the woman's upstairs neighbors heard crying and came to investigate. The rapist left quickly. In the fourth Arlington rape, he put a tape over his victim's mouth, and Diane Cho's mouth was also taped, and he tied her up. In Debbie Davis's case, as Detective Ray Williams investigated, they soon realized they were dealing with a meticulous killer. When they received reports back from forensics and there was no hair, no fibers, no physical evidence, nothing, no witness and nobody talking about it, the police didn't have any idea how the killer might be related to the victims. This perpetrator was awfully bold, breaking in and doing the things he did to her with people in the apartments right next door, but nobody heard anything. In Dr. Hellam's case, by the first impression of Dr. Hellam's house told nothing of what lay inside. No evidence of forced entry in the front of the house. Police walk in and go back to the kitchen and didn't see anything disturbed. This was no ordinary killer. This was a very unique individual. It was clear that whoever had killed her had surprised her somehow. The perpetrator had gotten into the home through an open window. The killer had demonstrated exceptional agility. He gained entry by climbing up on a fence to the second floor and cut the screen and climbed in that way. The investigators believe he most likely was hiding in the closet when she gets home. He let her take off her earrings, a watch, and lay it on the side table. This brutal killer lay in wait and attacked at the perfect time. Investigators were also horrified to discover the sadistic use of a homemade tourniquet. The florid petechia in her eye caused the medical examiner to suggest the strangulation of her might have taken up to 20 minutes. The tightening to cause her to suffocate, then to release in order to revive her, in order to do it again and again and again. What is sadistically important is that he is in total control over the victim and having her die slowly and having her suffer, then having her know that he is in complete control of her life. It is arousing to him, and so he's going to try to prolong her agonies as much as possible in order to satisfy himself. The unique sadistic traits displayed in both the Southside killings brought police to a chilling conclusion. The ritualistic nature of the killings, the meticulous alteration of the crime scene were identified in both murders, so investigators knew they were looking for one person. Now dubbed the Southside Strangler, police intended to think quite candidly that they were looking for a white guy, probably about 30 years old, but they would be wrong. He was intelligent, a loner. He didn't talk about his crimes, not to anyone. He roamed at night. Law enforcement thought the previous history of these crimes, but that this man wasn't a beginner. That this was an experienced individual who had done this before. He knew what he was doing. In the case of Susan Tucker, Detective Joe Horgus was off duty when he got the call. On the outside, investigators found the point of entry, which was a basement window underneath these metal balconies. There was an unusually large amount of seminal fluid outside on this blanket. Investigators believed that as he was killing her, he was pleasuring himself. Unusually large amount of seminal fluid and outside on this blanket. The thought was after she died, he was standing outside. He pleasured himself to the gruesome murder. No witness and the sadistic nature of the strangulation prompted investigators to look to the past cases. The story begins with 1984 murder of Caroline Hamm in Arlington, Virginia. She was raped, tied up. The body was found face down, nude. A piece of cord had been cut from the Venetian blinds. A knife was also on the floor. A local man was serving time for Caroline's murder, but with the similarities between the attacks, investigators found it difficult to ignore. They were now beginning to question whether the right man had been convicted. Investigators also recalled a string of unsolved sexual attacks that had featured similar sadistic traits. Displayed in the murders of Caroline Hamm and Susan Tucker, detectives knew there was a rapist who was working the area, breaking into apartments, and they called him the Black Masked Rapist. He was so prolific, he was in the home with his ropes waiting for the women when they came home. Had to be the scariest thing imaginable. They called the FBI profile unit. They agreed that the odds are that this black rapist was the murderer. The FBI gave investigators some vital information that when the black rapist attacked the first girl, the perpetrator took her to another area, another location. There's a good real chance that the suspect lived in the area because he would have taken her somewhere where he is comfortable. The reason they're within a comfort zone is because they're trying to do this in a way that they won't get caught. They know the streets. They know how the police patrol the area. When the police investigation progressed, a clue came to light. The victims were unwittingly connected. Debbie Davis actually worked part-time at the Walden Books and in the Cloverleaf Mall. And they went back through all the receipts of that store and found out that Dr. Susan Helms had actually purchased books in that store and had written a check to Debbie Davis. And young Diane Cho often visited the Cloverleaf Mall. In nearby Chesterfield County, the stores inside the popular hangout was often bustling with shoppers, but amongst the crowd was a solitary figure. He would go unnoticed. 25-year-old Timothy Spencer wasn't known to many of the locals, for he was 100 miles away from his hometown in Arlington, Virginia. Police started to link the crimes together. Diane Cho lived less than a mile from the Cloverleaf Mall. As Arlington detectives focused their efforts, potential suspects were whittled out. Investigator Ray Williams said, "There was someone that had been bothering me 5 or 6 years earlier. There was a man who was doing burglaries. All of a sudden I remember Timmy, and then Timmy Spencer came to mind." The 25-year-old career criminal had been brought up in Green Valley area of Arlington. His family home was located just a short distance from the site of the first rape in 1983. Detectives also established that the 25-year-old Arlington man had recently been released from prison. So we called up the parole office, and that's where we found out that he was actually in a halfway house in Richmond. Then investigators, of course, became involved with Arlington police, and they started to piece all this together. We met with detectives Ray Williams, which would soon become apparent that Spencer, far more than the rapes and murder of Caroline Ham. Arlington and Richmond detectives discovered shocking similarities between the most recent murders in the two districts, and movements of Timothy Spencer were also impossible to ignore. They recovered the sign-out sheets from the halfway house. Every time he signed out coordinated with every murder. Not only did he sign out during the time of every murder down in Richmond, he requested and received a furlough to go to Arlington for Thanksgiving, the same weekend that Susan Tucker was killed. As detectives delved into Spencer's history, they would discover a disturbing pattern of behavior. The big circumstance that came to mind during the FBI's profile was the arson. Every indicator shows that he went through a transition of escalation. He started breaking into homes, and then he would break in and defecate there. He gradually grew from there, where many times he broke into the house and then took the things and went next door and waited for a woman to come home. Often someone who becomes a sexual offender starts with sexual burglary of intimate things because it's like an experiment to see if they can get away with it. If they enjoy it, they will now progress to trespassing against a person, which usually is some kind of molesting or rape. Then that can lead to torture sex or murder. Having established a clear picture of their suspect, police made the decision to arrest Timothy Wilson Spencer. Police were on the street outside the halfway house when he came walking in. We walked in and cuffed him and took him to headquarters. January 20th, 1988, he was interviewed for 12 hours. He never admitted anything. He just said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He spoke well. He didn't use a lot of street slang. He was very articulate. However, the horrific crimes had been perpetrated by a careful and calculating killer with limited circumstantial evidence to call on. There was a danger that Spencer might get away with murder. Following a series of sadistic sexual murders in Virginia, Arlington and Richmond police had combined forces to arrest Timothy Wilson Spencer. Was based on circumstantial evidence, but recent advances in forensic science will offer them an unprecedented opportunity. It would go down into U.S. history. They were the first DNA murder case. Although police were dealing with a meticulous adversary, they were hoping to match Spencer's blood sample with deposits of semen found at the crime scenes. It would be Susan Tucker's case that would bring the Southside Strangler to justice. During the crime scene investigation, it would later be found that the medical examiner determined that the cause of death to be ligature strangulation. Tucker had been dead 3 to 5 days before her body was found. When Susan Tucker's body was discovered, a blue sleeping bag was partially draped over her buttocks. A brown blanket was underneath her, and her nightgown was on the bed. There were large seminal stains on all 3 items. Pubic hairs of African American origin were found on the blanket, and in the bathroom sink on the counter around the sink. The pubic hairs also were found on a washcloth that apparently had been taken from Tucker's bathroom and dropped on a bush a short distance from her home. It seemed that Timothy Wilson Spencer got sloppy with his last murders. Timothy Wilson Spencer had entered the townhouse by breaking a sliding basement window located under the balcony at the rear of the house. Glass samples of the broken window were taken. On January 20th, 1988, Arlington County Police arrested Timothy Spencer. At the time of his arrest, police seized a camouflage jacket from Spencer. After advising him of his rights, police officers asked Spencer to voluntarily give blood, hair, and saliva samples. In doing so, he made a costly mistake. Although officers told Spencer he was charged with burglary, Spencer asked if it had anything to do with the rape. When the officer informed him that the crime had occurred in Arlington, Spencer inquired again, "Does this have anything to do with murder then?" Spencer had visited his mother's Arlington home over the Thanksgiving holiday, arriving Thanksgiving morning on November 26th and departing on the following Sunday on November 29th. Spencer's mother lived approximately 7 blocks from Susan Tucker's townhouse. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy obtained oral, rectal, and vaginal swabs and a blood sample from Susan Tucker's body. Forensic analysis found that the African-American pubic hairs found on the washcloth and on the blanket from Susan Tucker's bed and on the bathroom sink were microscopically consistent with the known samples from Timothy Wilson Spencer's pubic hairs. Forensic science also determined that glass fragments found in Spencer's camouflage jacket matched that of Susan Tucker's broken basement window. Analysis of the seminal stains found on Tucker's nightgown, the blanket, and the sleeping bag were a match to Timothy Wilson Spencer's blood and saliva samples. But it matched to the crime in Arlington. It matched to 2 of the 3 crimes in Richmond. So authorities had 3 cases with DNA evidence. They knew who it was, but could they convince a jury of the new science? The police continued to build their case. They had observed video of Spencer's movements at the Cloverleaf Mall, a location that had been frequented by 3 of the victims. He sat in the middle of the mall for hours watching women walking by. He never bought a thing. He wouldn't cause any problems. Once he found a woman, he would just follow her around. He was very meticulous in picking out his target. Between July of 1988 and June of 1989, Timothy Wilson Spencer would face charges for the rapes and murders of 4 women in Arlington and in the Richmond, Virginia. Although implicated in the murder of Caroline Ham, prosecutors decided to try him only on the most recent murders. Prosecutors never saw any indication that he was at all troubled by what he was hearing in court. He sat there unmoved by what was going on. Spencer would only look interested as prosecutors distributed images from the horrific crime scenes. He wanted to see those pictures, his handiwork. He would actually stretch and lean over the desk to see the pictures, looking at every single picture. Prosecutors said he was so bad there was no way in the world that even though they were opposed to the death penalty, they were not going to take a chance that this man would be getting out onto the streets again. He was truly a sick individual. Spencer was found guilty of the murders of Richmond residents in 1988. Debbie Davis, Dr. Susan Helms, and Diane Cho, and the Arlington resident Susan Tucker. The man previously convicted of Caroline Ham's murder would be pardoned and released. Timothy Wilson Spencer was sentenced to death. As Spencer was placed on death row, the question remained, how have this serial burglar and rapist ended up as the most sadistic of killers? His brother Travis had a hard time believing his brother would ever murder someone, but DNA doesn't lie. Timothy Wilson Spencer was a very angry, controlling person. He wanted to control people, and he obviously hated women for some reason. It's not the sexual part of the crime so much. That doesn't give them the satisfaction. For some reason, they're harbored an inner anger towards women. Psychiatrists said the torture part is part of the anger and releasing that anger towards his victim. A sexual deviant psychopath. Something was definitely broken in Timothy Wilson Spencer's mind. Timothy Wilson Spencer executed at the Greensville Correctional Center on April the 27th of 1984, a relatively short time for a murder victim on death row. Detective Ray Williams was asked to witness it, and he said, "I deal with death every day, and it's just a legal way for the state to kill somebody. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve to die, because he'll never kill anyone again, but I still have mixed emotions about the death penalty. Timothy's family was there with him before he was executed. Travis said, "I was there for his last day on this earth. When they told us we had 2 minutes left to talk, it's devastating that you're sitting with a person perfectly healthy. They damn near had to pry our hands apart." His mother let out a soul-wrenching scream, desperately not wanting to let go of her son. No matter what you've done, a mother's love endures to the end. The room where witnesses sat waiting was inside the death house in Virginia's Greenville Correctional Center. At the time, the execution chamber was pretty much a bare room made of concrete blocks painted a bright white. Sitting center stage was old Sparky, the state's electric chair, an instrument of death that ironically was built by prison inmates. The atmosphere that night was nothing short of surreal. No one spoke, no one coughed, nothing, not a sound, as witnesses waited for the door at the rear of the chamber to open. After an eternity passed, revealing the handful of prison officials who entered first, and then Timothy Wilson Spencer, who walked calmly into the chamber, surrounded by members of the prison's death squad, specially trained uniformed corrections officers. Timothy's brother, mother, uncle, grandmother, and grandfather saw him before his execution. Timothy Wilson Spencer refused to meet with the FBI and turned down requests for interviews from the media. He even asked authorities not to disclose the contents of his last meal, basically controlling every element of his life to the very end. Above all else, Timothy Wilson Spencer was the epitome of antisocial. Timothy strolled confidently into the silver-gray death chamber and rubbed his newly shaved scalp and stared straight up at the clock over the electric chair. His last outfit was gray shower shoes, a powder blue shirt, and jeans cut off at the right leg to improve the flow of the current of electricity that would go through his body. Snaps and zippers were replaced with Velcro to avoid an electric short. The chaplain rubbed Spencer's back, then stepped into the witness booth and softly recited the Lord's Prayer. Timothy Wilson Spencer had walked the 8 short steps to the chamber from the death watch cell, and he's done so on his own without assistance from members of the squad. Sometimes the squad in the past had to basically force inmates to the execution chamber, but not Timothy. It's hard to fathom what sort of mindset it takes to make that short and very final walk. Spencer, though, seemed prepared for what was to come, and he made his peace with it. His face was absent of emotion, no frown, no tears, no smile, nothing. He was a man who seemed more like a robot than a human, with a beating heart, a thinking brain, and no conscience. The man who'd brutally killed so many women was shorter and a bit more wiry than most people picture when thinking of the Southside Strangler. Dots of perspiration peppered his forehead and shaved head like raindrops on a freshly waxed car. Spencer looked out at the people that were there to witness his death. His eyes moved slowly from side to side and up and down, taking in the surroundings and the faces of the witnesses. Spencer blinked a bit when looking at the bright overhead lights. After glancing around the brightly lit surroundings, Spencer took a seat in the oak chair and calmly allowed the death squad to carry out their business of fastening straps, belts, and electrodes. As they secured his arms and legs tightly to the oak chair, he looked on, seemingly uninterested in what they were doing. Witness Lee Laughlin, that sat directly in front of the cold-blooded killer, mere feet away, separated by a partial wall of glass. Spencer's gaze met his, and that's where his focus remained for the next few minutes or so. Not even a remote sign of sadness, regret, or fear. Either he was brave, heavily sedated, or a man without a soul. The squad's final task was to place a metal colander-like hat on Spencer's head. The hat, like the leg connection, was linked with a brine-soaked sea sponge that serves as an excellent connector of electricity. The prison chaplain described, "I detest what goes on here." The witness, Mr. Laughlin, wondered, did Spencer know? His muscles would contract, causing his body to lunge forward, that the heat would literally make his blood boil, that the electrode's contact points were going to burn his skin. Did he know that his joints were going to fuse, leaving him in a sitting position? Had anyone told him that later someone would have to use sandbags to straighten out his body? Had he wondered why they'd replaced the metal buttons on his clothes with Velcro? Did they tell him that the buttons would have melted? For the previous 24 hours, Spencer had seen the flurry of activity inside the death house. He'd heard the death squad practicing and testing the chair. He'd seen them rehearsing their takedown techniques in case he decided to resist while they escorted him to the chamber. He watched them swing their batons at a make-believe prisoner. He saw their glances and he heard their mutterings. Was he thinking about what he'd done? Why he'd killed those women? What drove him to take human lives so callously? The warden asked Mr. Spencer if he cared to say any final words, a time when many condemned murderers ask for forgiveness and offer an apology to family members of the people they've murdered. The warden asked Spencer if he had any last words. He replied with 3 words, "Yeah, I think." After a long pause, those were the last words spoken by Timothy Wilson Spencer, the Southside Strangler. Whatever he was about to say, well, he took it to his grave. He made eye contact with the witness again, and it was a chilling experience to look into the eyes of a serial killer just mere seconds before he himself was killed. Some of the people in the room focused on the red telephone hanging on the wall at the rear of the chamber, a direct line to the governor. Spencer's last hope to live beyond the next few seconds. It remained silent. The warden nodded to the executioner, who, by the way, remained behind the glass inside the chamber, out of everyone's sight. Spencer must have sensed what was coming, and while looking directly into Mr. Laughlin's eyes, turned both thumbs upward. A last-second display of arrogance. Spencer received 1,825 volts at 7.5 amps for 37 seconds. When the lethal dose of electricity was introduced, it caused Timothy's body to swell and lurch forward against the restraints that held him tightly in the chair. Suddenly his body slumped into the chair. The burst of electricity was over. However, after a brief pause, the executioner sent a second jolt to the killer's body. 250 volts of 1.5 amps for 60 seconds was introduced to his body. Again his body swelled, but this time smoke began to rise from Spencer's head. Then the jolts were repeated. Why? Because in previous executions in 1991, when the prison doctor found the condemned still alive after being shocked 2 times, then drool ran down a face strap on his shirt, and Spencer's body relaxed. The unmistakable pungent odor of burning flesh filled the room. It was over, and an eerie calm filled the chamber. No one moved for 5 long minutes. The wait time was to allow the body to cool down. The hot flesh would have burned anyone who touched it. The prison doctor slowly walked to the chair where he placed a stethoscope against Spencer's chest and listened for a heartbeat. A few seconds passed before the doctor looked up and said, "Warden, this man has expired." It was over. Timothy Wilson Spencer, one of the worst serial killers in America's history, was dead. Outside the prison, Wayne Brown, operations officer at Greenville's Correctional Center, delivered a statement to the press. The man known as the Southside Strangler, Timothy Wilson Spencer, was pronounced dead at 11:13 p.m., said Brown. Jerry Gibbons, a former executioner for the Commonwealth of Virginia, the man who executed Timothy Wilson Spencer, described his opinion of the death penalty when he said, "If I execute an innocent man, I am no better than the people on death row." Gibbons, after executing 62 people, now strongly opposes the death penalty. The Washington Post, Friday, April 29, 1994. Serial killer Timothy Wilson Spencer, the first person in the country convicted of capital crime through DNA testing, died in the state electric chair late Wednesday night. The man known as the Southside Strangler was pronounced dead at 11:13 p.m. His electrocution came after a flurry of last-minute legal efforts that went as high as the U.S. Supreme Court, which rejected a request for a stay at 10:45 p.m. Mr. Spencer's attorneys had frantically pleaded for retesting of the DNA genetic material that led to his convictions for raping and murdering 4 women during a 10-week rampage in 1987. A crowd of about 100 gathered outside the prison, about half of them death penalty opponents, conducting a candlelight prayer vigil. The rest were local high school students who boisterously cheered for Spencer's death. As death penalty opponents sang Amazing Grace, some of the students yelled, "Kill the bitch." The case was watched closely nationwide because Spencer, 32 years of age, was the first defendant ever sentenced to death on the basis of DNA genetic fingerprinting. According to state specialists, the chances were less than 1 in 700 million that someone other than Spencer had left the semen at the murder scenes. His conviction was such a legal milestone that it prompted Virginia to open the first state DNA laboratory in the country and inspired mystery writer Patricia D. Cornwell's popular 1990 novel, Postpartum. It was a landmark case because prior to that, none of us really knew much about DNA, and we didn't know whether a jury would be able to understand that sufficiently to convict someone for something as serious as capital murder. Notorious Mind not only looks at the life of the perpetrator, but strives to look at the lives of the victims as well. They should never be forgotten, for they paid the price of this sadistic psychopath. Timothy Wilson Spencer was a very sick and deviant individual, very controlling and methodical with what he did. The only mistake he made was not knowing about DNA. If he had, they never would have caught him. This new science of DNA genetic fingerprinting changed the face of criminal investigations, made the families of the victims of Debbie Davis, Dr. Susan Helms, Diane Cho, and Carolyn Ham find the peace they richly deserve.
This is Notorious Minds with M.R. Parks. Please like and share, and by all means, subscribe to this channel. Remember to click the notification bell so that you will be notified the next time a future video is uploaded. Take care of yourselves and be safe out there. See you next time.